All right, thanks everyone for joining us. This is our last session for our Fall Virtual Educational Summit. I am Marcel, I'm the Executive Director for Contract Cities, coming to you live from the Contract Cities virtual voting headquarters, where we encourage you to vote in person, but if nothing else, please just vote. Today we have some speakers that are going to talk to us about our voter engagement. We're also going to talk about the ballot measures that are coming up in the November election. Just so you all know, we're taking, this is a nonpartisan approach, just as unbiased, we're just giving you the facts. And we're going to hear from Jenny Carrion from Ultimed, who is going to talk to us about some of the voter engagement. And then we'll talk a little bit about the numbers that we've seen historically. So before we get started, I'd like to introduce our president, Lindsay Horvath. Take it away, Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Marcel, and thank you to our panelists for today's event. This virtual seminar has been a different kind of experience this year, but hopefully it's still provided you all with the information that you've come to rely on and expect from Contract Cities. This session is usually one of my favorites at the fall seminar. And I know James has a lot of experience doing it, has done a great job. I'm excited to see Debbie partner with him this year on that. But I know that we have a big ballot coming up in November, and there's a lot to be aware of, a lot that will impact our cities, and a lot that we want to make sure we're educating our communities about as well. So I'm grateful that they've taken the time to really go through each of these items to share with us and take this opportunity to make sure we're all aware of what's before us. And thank you to our staff at Contract Cities who work so hard all the time to make all of this possible and to support us in our cities each and every day. I'm grateful to everyone who's able to participate and everybody who will watch a little bit later on to benefit from this presentation. I know it will be shared after today's event, and hopefully it will be exactly what you need in your communities. And thank you once again.
Thank you, Lindsay. So yes, she's absolutely right. We are sharing these videos on our YouTube channels. Go to Contract Cities on YouTube, and you'll be able to view the other three sessions. And then within a day or two, we'll have this one posted up. So with no further ado, so we can get into the meat and the good stuff that we're here to talk about today. First, let me introduce Jenny Carrion. From government advocacy to nonprofit healthcare systems and educational programs for high-risk families to clean air coalitions and social justice movements, there's no one more passionate about our community than Jenny Carrion. Jenny is the AVP for Civic Engagement and Government Relations for Ultimed, which delivers more than 1 million annual patient visits through its 47 sites in Los Angeles and Orange counties. Jenny is a government relations strategist with 25 plus years of experience advocating for vulnerable populations, who oversees all of Ultimed's campaigns, civic engagement programs, and community building initiatives. She's also the founder and executive director of Ultimed PAC and oversees fundraising and the endorsement process for elected officials in all levels of office for the state of California. James Bozajian has served the Calabasas City Council since 1997, including 5 terms as mayor. He has been on the executive board of the California Contract Cities Association since 2008 and was its president in 2011-2012. He is currently vice president of the LA County Division of the League of California Cities and has been a member of its board of directors since 2019. James has been actively involved in the leadership of many professional and civic organizations, including the Los Angeles County Association of Deputy District Attorneys and the Agora Hills Calabasas Community Center Joint Powers Authority. Finally, Debbie Klein-Lopez was elected to the Agora Hills City Council in 2018 and joined the California Contract Cities Association Executive Board this year. So we're glad to have her. Her expanded role as a council member included serving on the executive board of the Clean Power Alliance, as well as the Agora Hills Calabasas Community Center. In addition, Debbie sits on the board of Resource Conservation District of the Santa Monica Mountains, has run overnight homeless shelter for 17 years, and works as a field rep in the California State Assembly. So with no further ado, I present to you Jenny Carrion. Take it away.
Thank you, Marcel, and good afternoon to everyone. Marcel, we can start the PowerPoint presentation, please. As Marcel mentioned, my name is Jenny, and I am the AVP of Civic Engagement at Ultimed Healthcare Organization. Ultimed is an organization that's been doing providing healthcare to underserved communities for the last 50 years. Next slide. And we're rooted in the social justice movement. We grew in an organization that started as a free clinic in East LA and is now the largest federally qualified health center throughout the country. As Marcel said, we serve close to 1 million patients annually. Next slide. And we believe that inequities in health are avoidable and unnecessary. So we deploy these social determinants of health. And one of those reasons that we do civic engagement is because we believe that is the core route to empower our community and change the power dynamics. Next slide. So we started this My Vote, My Health, Mi Voto, Mi Salud, which is a nonpartisan grassroots campaign that empowers Latinos and millennials to protect healthcare access and change the power dynamics in their communities. We do a 5-touch model inside our clinic and outside our clinic. So inside our clinic, it includes when we call our patients to remind them about their doctor's appointment, we remind them to bring their ballots in. We do door-to-door canvassing. We do texting. We have PSAs at all of our waiting rooms. And then we also provide rides to the ballots if need be to go drop them off. Or most of our clinics this year, we're lucky enough to be having flex voting. Inside our patient waiting rooms, there's PSAs playing. Our doctors also at the end of the appointment prescribe voting as medicine. Especially in an era of a pandemic and in sickness, we really believe that empowering our community to be an active participant in the policies that impact them the most, it's going to be imperative. Next slide. During the March election, during the primary election, we also expanded to San Isidro in San Diego and Alameda and Clínica de la Raza, which is in Oakland, up in Northern California. We contacted over 42,000 low propensity voters and knocked and dialed over 500,000 community members. We really think that in order to change the voting polls and who's going to be impacting our elections, we have to contact those that nobody else is reaching out to. And low propensity voters is a group that historically nobody touches and nobody gives them the information and the mechanics on how to vote. Next slide. And we partnered with UCLA this year, and we found that throughout the entire campaign, we saw close to 12.72% voter turnout in low propensity voters. As you know, our elected officials, usually if you have 4-point gain in any election, that's a huge victory and a huge point of celebration. So seeing a 12.72 gain in this work was extremely successful and a huge win for our community. Next slide. The research did a control and a placebo and a treatment group, and it furthermore validated that in instances when we had 3 conversations with one patient or community member, we saw an increase of close to 17.87%. And we're working with different foundations to expand this work throughout the state and target an additional 650 million Latino and low propensity voters in November. Next slide. We partnered with the Los Angeles Orange County County Registrar's Office. We had flex vote centers at all of our PACE centers. And at first, this was a challenge because Altamed healthcare centers are not seen as your technical, civic engagement advocates like a school or a library are. But in LA County at Altamed, we're really proud that we got the #1 voter turnout in all of the 42 flex vote centers that were open during the primary election. Next slide. And this is what our 5-touch model looks like. We have toolkits, we have posters, and more importantly, everything is downloadable because we believe that we're really going to make an impact. Every organization, every city, every healthcare company that exists needs to be actively promoting civic engagement and talking to their patients or residents about the mechanics of voting. Next slide. This is what some of our materials look like for this year. We also have postcards And we are working with 9 additional clinics throughout the state that are not AltaMed to teach their patients how to vote during a time of pandemic. Next slide. These are the 9 other partners that we have throughout the state of California. So this year for November, we'll be targeting close to 1 million low propensity voters. Next slide. We have 12 days until the election that we're talking to everyone about. There's an election season, not an election day. So 12 days until October 6th, when we're able to first vote by mail, and then 40 days until the last day to vote. Next slide. And I did it all under 5 minutes, everyone. Here's our QR code that if you can you can show your camera and take a quick picture of it. All of our information is there. And we're happy to partner up with any of the cities that are interested in expanding their civic engagement work, and look forward to working with you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. We appreciate you doing that hard work to make sure that people are out there and voting. So now I'm going to hand it over to James and to Debbie. They're going to kind of switch back and forth. So James, Debbie, if you will, take it away. You're muted, James. There you go.
Okay, sorry. Thank you all very much. Glad to be back. And we're going to go through the ballot propositions. And then if you have questions, you can ask them during this time. So let's move on to the next slide. First of all, the historic voter registration statistics. I always like to show these because they show some tremendous significance in how California has emerged over just the last 30 years. You've seen 2 phenomena. First, the decline of the Republican Party. The Republicans have sloughed a tremendous amount of registration. Almost half, if you look at the state and the county, almost half of what it was just 30 years ago. And there is a movement away from the party such that now independents or declined estates are eclipsing Republicans as the second party, if you will, in California. The second thing is the Democrats haven't really gained because they've lost a little bit too. What's increased tremendously is people not affiliated with either party. And that has accelerated over time because we no longer have strict primary voting. It's an open primary where there's no real benefit to registering as a Republican or Democrat. You can still vote for the candidate of your choice. If we go to the next slide, it'll show Los Angeles County, which also shows much the same thing. And their Republicans too have gone down. Democrats have gone down just a little bit. And then the big winner is the other, which is mostly independents and declined estate. Debbie, did you want to add anything?
No, I think you've said it all on that. Thank you.
Okay, let's go to Proposition 14, which is stem cell research bonds. Historically, going back in time, in 2004, we had a ballot proposition that was a stem cell research bond, and that created a source of money for stem cell research and medical facility construction and other costs associated with stem cells. That source of money is now depleted. This proposition would authorize $5.5 billion in state general obligation funds to fund stem cell research for various medical conditions, as well as research facility construction. And this would replenish that source. The costs calculated to repay these new bonds are estimated to run at about $260 million per year for the next 30 years. Debbie, did you have anything to add?
Not with Prop 14, other than it's not going to really affect us as council members and city representatives very much, this one.
And we'll be dwelling a little bit more on the propositions that do. So the next one's yours.
Great, thank you. Proposition 15 is a revision of property tax assessments, and I think that this is going to be likely one of the most talked about ballot measures of the season, as it seeks to revise the commercial portion of the famous Prop 13. So as we know, the tax base for real property is calculated at the purchase price at a rate of approximately 1.1%. And then every year the rate goes up, but it's capped at for inflation at a maximum of 2%. So with some exceptions, when the property is turned over, then the base resets. And we will talk about some of those exceptions later in the presentation as it affects another ballot measure. If we go to the next slide, we'll see that if this is approved, what Prop 15 will do is it would have the commercial and industrial properties taxed based on the current market value rather than their initial purchase price. So a lot of times people are referring to this as split roll. The residential properties, agricultural land, and owners of small commercial industrial properties of $3 million or less would be exempted, and they would remain taxed at their original purchase price. And the reason that split roll is being floated this year is because the voters are going to be asked to decide whether the additional revenue that would be generated from these commercial tax resets, whether that should go to public schools, community colleges, local governments, because it would end up raising about $6.5 to $11.5 billion annually. So very hot topic, and I'm sure we'll have some questions on that we'll get to. Thank you. Back to you, James.
Okay, and I think this one will receive the most campaign money and advertising of any of the propositions. There was one other that might be close, but this isn't the most. Prop 16, if we can go to the next slide. Okay, historically, back in 1996, signatures were gathered by voters. In California, voters approved a prohibition on discrimination against preferential treatment for individuals and groups on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, education, or contracting. And what this did is it eliminated all such programs in California and put it in the state constitution. It was the language used from the US Constitution in the 5th and 14th Amendments that was adopted and placed in the California Constitution. This ended all programs ranging from affirmative action to racial set-asides and preferences, quotas, whatever kinds of programs there were gone. And the constitutionality of that has been upheld. Right now, if Proposition 16 is approved, going to the next slide, it would repeal the 1996 initiative. And so we would go back to the pre-1996 law, which did allow such preferences to be given in public and governmental agencies. This would affect everything from university admissions to hiring at your local government level if the agency approved some kind of program that gave preferences. I would note one other thing. Since 1996, there has been a growing body of case law at the federal level, which really does restrict even more the ability to implement affirmative action, racial preferences, gender preferences, et cetera. So there will be challenges if it does pass, but if it passes, it takes it out of the state constitution and removes that barrier to implementing these programs. Debbie?
The only thing I would add to Proposition 16, I saw that the LA Times and the League of Women Voters have already endorsed this as a yes. We'll stay away from some of the partisan endorsements, but those are two notable endorsements that have already come out early. So next slide. Okay, Proposition 17. As we know, inmates who are sentenced to state prison for committing felony offenses are typically released on parole for a limited time following incarceration. And right now, if those inmates or parolees have served their state prison sentences and are still on parole, they are ineligible to vote until the parole is up. So if we can go to the next slide. Proposition 17, if approved, would restore voting rights to those who have been released from prison on parole and would potentially allow them to serve in elective public office. It would affect approximately 50,000 individuals. If you are still incarcerated, you would not have this right. This was only relevant to parolees. And I would say that, again, Los Angeles Times and League of Women Voters have already come out early as supporting this. We'll see what some of the other publications and groups have to say about it. Anything to add on this one, James?
No. let's go to Proposition 18, which is a very simple and straightforward measure. It's one of the easiest ones to understand. Right now, of course, you must be 18 years old on the date of an election in order to vote in that election. If this were to be approved, that would change. It would allow 17-year-olds to vote in primary or special elections. We can go to the next slide. If they would be 18 years old on the date of the next general election. So in other words, to use an example this year, if on March 3rd of this year, you're a 17-year-old, but you're going to be in California, if you're going to be 18 on November 3rd, you could vote in the California primary election. It also applies to special elections. We did have a special congressional election in the 25th Congressional District here in Los Angeles County in the Santa Clarita Valley in May. And again, if a 17-year-old wanted to vote in that election, they could if they would be 18 on November 3rd. If this passes in 2 years, it will be on that cycle. In 2022, our primary is back in June. And so a 17-year-old in June could vote if they would be 18 by the day of the election in November. Anything else, Debbie?
Nope.
Okay.
Nope. Like you said, straightforward. Okay, Proposition 19, maybe not so straightforward. So again, as we talked about earlier in the presentation, in general, you are taxed on the purchase price of your property, which then resets when the property is sold. One exception is when a property passes between parents and children or grandparents and grandchildren, then you can also transfer the existing tax base without reassessment. Another exception is for homeowners who are over 55, severely disabled, or whose homes were destroyed by natural disaster. They can also transfer their primary residence original property tax base to a replacement value of any value, to a replacement residence of any value within the same county once in their lifetime. So that's the way it stands right now. If we go to the next slide, you'll see that what Proposition 19 would change is it would expand the tax base exemption for the seniors, the disabled, and the natural disasters to allow for this transfer of the tax base anywhere in the state, not just the county, and for up to 3 times, not just once. It would also narrow the exception for the inherited property transfers from, parent to child or grandparent to grandchild, only in situations where this property is used as a primary home or for farming. And I think the idea is to not incentivize people to transfer the property base, but then use those properties as rental properties. And finally, the property taxes for an inherited home or farm would go up if the price of the property could be sold for exceeding the property's value by more than $1 million. So it's a little bit complicated, but it's basically trying to tighten up some of those transfer rules. For what it's worth, again, I know LA Times and League of Women Voters have both weighed in as a no on this, and it will be interesting to see what other groups come out with. James, do you have anything to add?
I did. Normally the state will tell you what the anticipated revenues or losses are. They were unable to do that in this case because you see the conflicting provisions that some will give us more tax revenue, some will give us less. Their best guess is that it will probably give the state more tax revenue because they're going to get less from people who transfer multiple times around the state, their primary residence. If they fall into that first bullet point, that will be less revenue for the state, but they will get more from inherited properties where the inheritors do not use the residence as a primary residence. So unknown what the fiscal effect is. The state's best guess is probably more tax revenue for the state. I will go to Proposition 20, which is another one that's a little bit more complicated. Okay, laws have changed regarding recidivism and nonviolent crimes in California. In general, the law has become more lenient and recidivist statutes have been loosened and weakened over the years. And this proposition is a cleanup proposition that is generally strengthening criminal statutes and returning some of them to felonies. We'll go through some of the major provisions. The main one is that nonviolent and theft-related offenses of property worth less than $950 right now is considered a petty theft and is punishable as a misdemeanor. And also currently, as we all know, DNA samples are collected from adults in criminal cases. And that's if they are arrested for, charged with, or convicted of a felony. They're also collected from young offenders, youth meaning under 18, minors who have committed a felony, and people who are required to register as sex offenders or arsonists. These DNA databases are later then used to identify other crimes and criminals. And there are about 100,000 new samples entered in every year. Let's go to the revisions if approved and go through them one by one so we can understand them. The main revision is it will allow for 2 exceptions to the punishment of nonviolent theft-related offenses, and they would potentially result in the prosecution of some of these cases as felonies. They would make them what we call wobblers, which means that the prosecutor would have the discretion to charge them as misdemeanors or felonies. It would not be automatic. One example would be where the perpetrator has 2 or more prior convictions for theft-related offenses, and the property that is stolen in the instant crime is worth more than $250. So 2 or more prior convictions, the current case has a property value, a loss of more than $250, could now be a felony if this is approved. The second major example of this would be where the perpetrator acts in concert with others in committing 2 or more theft-related offenses within a 180-day period, and the total value of the property stolen exceeds $250. In other words, multiple serial thefts that are petty in and of themselves, but over a 180-day period, if it's a group of people committing these thefts and the property exceeds $250, that alone could make it a felony. It would also expand the collection of DNA samples from convicted criminals, and it would include adults convicted of certain specified misdemeanors. In case you were wondering what those were, it includes things such as domestic violence, some nonviolent theft-related offenses that are misdemeanors, and forgery. Those are some examples of the misdemeanors that are specified in the code. So that would be added to the DNA base upon conviction. This proposition would also alter how inmates released from state prison are supervised in the community, generally providing for stricter supervision and additional penalties for parole violations. It would modify some of the rules governing grants of parole to state prison inmates, generally speaking, making it more difficult for them to be paroled early. One final note, this proposition was a signature gathering proposition. It was presented in 2018. There was not enough time for the state to verify the signatures, so it's a holdover, and it's been waiting a couple of years, and now it appears on your ballot this November. Debbie, did you have anything to add?
The only thing I would add is just in simplest terms, this proposition is meant to give prosecutors discretion to pursue harsher sentences in retail crimes. It is supported by some law enforcement groups as well as some grocery chains. And of course, the opposition says that this would lead to over-sentencing of non-violent crimes, and former Governor Jerry Brown is among the opposition. So with that, we can move to Prop 21. So I think Prop 21 is going to be another one of the propositions that is going to receive a lot of attention, a lot of discussion, and it's about rent control. So right now, rent control does not apply to single family homes for any housing built after February of 1995, and it cannot dictate what landlords charge new renters upon moving in. Rent control for housing that is more than 15 years old, landlords cannot increase rent by more than 5% plus inflation in any given year, or 10%, whichever is lower. So moving on to what Proposition 21 would do, is it would allow local governments to enact local limits on annual rent increases that different from the present statewide limit. Establishes rent control on all residential properties over 15 years old, and or limits the rent increases in rent control properties to no more than 15% over 3 years at the start of the new tenancy. It would exempt from its provisions individuals who own no more than 2 single-family homes. So basically what this would do is, it's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong here, it replaces Costa-Hawkins, which restricts cities from enacting local rent control parameters. And Prop 21 would allow cities to impose rent control on single-family houses or condominiums if the owners own more than 2, and that is intention to a response for investment companies that buy up properties around town. So it's going to be a very debatable proposition, I think, coming up. Anything to add on that, James?
I do. I do have a couple things. This proposition, probably more than any other, will impact local government, because if this passes, local governments will then have the ability to engage in the rent control debate. And you will see all types of proposals coming forward at the local level that were precluded by state law previously. So I think this will be very meaningful and impactful to local elected officials. Many local elected officials are in favor, some are many are opposed. It's all over the map. But whatever the outcome of how they feel, if this is approved, you can expect that you will be dealing with this issue at your local level. So it's very important to take a look at this proposition and follow it.
Absolutely. And I forgot to add, it's already all over the board in terms of endorsements. The LA Times gives it a yes, the SACB gives it a no, League of Women Voters is a neutral, and I believe that Contract Cities has also taken a neutral position on this proposition.
Right. I should have mentioned that Contract Cities has only endorsed Prop 20 so far, and has taken a neutral position on 21. You're correct. Let's go to 22. Okay. This is another proposition that is a result of action that was taken in the state legislature. And so this is another attempt to revise a legislative statute mandate. So there are currently legal challenges now pending to the state law, but it's been tentatively interpreted to require that rideshare and delivery companies must hire drivers as employees and not as independent contractors. That interpretation has consequences because as employees, drivers do receive standard job benefits and protections, and those include such things as minimum wage, overtime, workers' compensation, unemployment insurance, and leave time. In return, on the contrary side, these workers have less discretion about the conditions of their employment because they are employees and not independent contractors, whereas independent contractors do not get the protections of employees, but they do have more discretion about their conditions of employment. So here's what Proposition 22 would do if approved. We can go to the next slide. It would classify drivers for these app-based transportation and delivery companies as independent contractors and not as employees, unless a company sets drivers' hours, requires acceptance of specific ride or delivery requests, or restricts working for other companies. Essentially, what it's saying is that these will be independent contractors unless the companies are essentially treating them as employees with conditions that they normally would give to employees. It would entitle independent contractors to other forms of compensation. This would include minimum earnings, healthcare subsidies, and vehicle insurance. That's written into the proposition. And it would limit the ability of cities and counties to place additional rules on rideshare and delivery companies. So it would be preemptive in that sense. Debbie?
The only thing I would add is that the state law that this is referring to is AB 5, Assembly Bill 5, authored by Lorena Gonzalez. And I think many of us have some experience with AB 5 as we contract out some of our community services and things like that. So that's what this is in response to. Okay, next slide. Proposition 23, a state requirement for kidney dialysis. This requires that at least one licensed physician is on site during treatment of an outpatient kidney dialysis clinic. There are some exemptions if there's a shortage of staff and physicians. It requires clinics to report dialysis-related infection to state and federal governments, prohibits clinics from closing or reduces services without state approval, and prohibits clinics from refusing to treat patients based on their ability to pay, their insurance, their source of payment for care. This is not particularly too relevant to us as city leaders. So far it's got a no from the LA Times and a neutral from League of Women Voters, and not seeing this come up in our on our dais too much, but you know, we'll all be voting one way or another, hopefully, on this. Anything to add, James?
No. Let's go to Prop 24, which affects consumer privacy laws. As we know, businesses do collect data about consumers, and they get it from public sources, consumers themselves, and other business databases. They turn around and use this information for marketing purposes. In California, the collection and use of this data is regulated by various consumer privacy laws. So if approved, this is another complicated measure. There are a lot of little things in there, but I took out the major ones that are really motivating this. First of all, it would reduce the number of businesses that are regulated by consumer data privacy requirements. So the statutes are now applicable to businesses that buy, sell, or share for commercial purposes the personal data of 100,000 consumers or households annually. That's the threshold. It would lower the, the present threshold is 50,000. It would raise the threshold to 100,000. So in other words, it would raise it, allowing those businesses to engage in this consumer data transfer as long as they stayed under the 100,000 consumer or household threshold annually. That would give them more leverage. It would also change existing consumer data privacy requirements that businesses must meet. In some cases, the proposed criteria are more stringent, such as a mandate that businesses notify consumers of the length of time they will keep the personal data. In others, they're less stringent, such as allowing businesses to keep certain data that would otherwise be deleted upon request. So, you know, this reminds me of just one little axiom that I've learned over the years. Generally speaking, the more difficult it is to understand a proposition and the more complicated and convoluted the exceptions and all the rules are, the less likely it is to pass. That is a proven fact. Another thing is, if you see polling numbers, assuming the polling numbers are accurate, and they're not always accurate, if you go into election day and something is not polling at close to 50% or 50%, most of the undecideds are either not going to vote or they're going to vote no. So just keep those things in mind as we go through, as you see the polling numbers. Debbie?
The only thing I would add to Proposition 24, like James says, it's a little complex, and even who's behind it, the notable support for it is really a San Francisco real estate developer, and the notable opposition is the ACLU of California and Consumer Federation of California, with some mixed endorsements. So if we want to go to Prop 25. Okay, so what Prop 25 is actually a referendum of Senate Bill 10, which eliminated cash bail. And so a yes on this will uphold SB 10 and a no would repeal. And the way it stands currently is, you know, when a defendant is charged with a crime and held in custody, the defendant is either eligible for release on his or her own recognizance or contingent upon the posting of bail. And when making decisions relating to releasing a defendant, the courts consider the seriousness of the offense, potential dangers posed by the defendant being released, a prior criminal record, and the likelihood that the defendant is going to reappear in court. And if the defendant is not released on his or her own recognizance, then the amount of bail is set up depending on those factors. In the most serious of offenses, sometimes there's no bail and the defendant must remain detained. In 2018, again, the state legislature eliminated the present bail and enacted these new procedures. It didn't go into effect because of voter signatures, which is why we're here today having a say on the ballot with Prop 25. So if we can go to the next slide. If Prop 25 is approved, it would eliminate the present bail system. Most defendants charged with a misdemeanor would be automatically released within 12 hours of being placed in jail. The defendants charged with felonies and some of the more serious misdemeanors would be assessed for their risk of committing new crimes or failing to appear in court. The defendants found to be low risk would be removed from custody. Medium risk would have a little bit more subjectivity. It might be released, might be held. And those deemed high risk would remain. A small number, again, of the defendants charged with the most serious felonies would be denied bail. So again, a yes would enact SB 10 and eliminate the cash bail system that we have right now. A no would reject SB 10 and keep the present system in place. Anything to add, James?
No, you did marvelously.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
All right.
All right. Let's turn to our last proposition that we're going to analyze. This is the Los Angeles County measure that was put on the ballot by the Board of Supervisors very recently. It's now been labeled Measure J. It's entitled Alternatives to Incarceration. This measure would mandate that by 2024, at least 10% of the county's annual budget be permanently shifted from law enforcement related services to investment in various social programs. There is a long descriptor of what those might be, but there's nothing, there's no names that are identifiable yet in the language. As of now, if the total estimated amount of money that would be redirected is going to be approximately $500 million per year. That's based on the current budget. County agencies affected by these cuts would include the Sheriff's Department, the District Attorney's Office, the Superior Court, and the Probation Department. Debbie?
The only, what I would add is that, you know, this came from the Board of Supervisors of Los Angeles County. So they're, of course, on the support list. Black Lives Matter, United Way of LA, those are all groups that are supporting Measure J. There's some pretty stiff opposition to Measure J that includes many labor unions, including sheriff and ALADS. And I think this is going to be another one that is going to be a hot topic of discussion as it really will affect those of us, particularly in the contract cities. So that's all I have to add on that.
Let's go to historical California voter turnout. I always like these slides because they're kind of just interesting. And you can see that even in presidential election years where we hear about it, what a great turnout we had, you can see the turnout is not very high. And that's why it's important to educate voters and make sure they're registered to vote and they turn out to vote. Because as you can see, in a primary election, the registered voters don't really turn out at a very high rate. It's usually not even 50%. And if you go to eligible voters, you're getting in some territory there that used to be like our old municipal elections where hardly anybody would turn out to vote. Very, very light turnout in some years. It's obviously going to be a little bit higher in presidential election years than in the off years where there's only gubernatorial elections and statewide races. That's also a pattern. If you're wondering about 2008, we converted to a system that most states use where we had our presidential primary early and then we kept our June primary for state offices. And as you can see, it didn't work out too well because the state offices, very few people bothered voting for. Let's go to the general elections. Obviously higher turnout, higher interest, but still not exactly what you would expect. It hovers in the 50% range if you average it out for eligible voters, and of course higher for registered voters, and it is higher in presidential election years and in gubernatorial election years. Early on in this country's history, it was the opposite. People were not interested in federal elections. Their governors had most of the power, and you see a reverse of this, but there is a trend. Lately, we've had a little better turnout. So Debbie, any comments?
I would just add that I would not be surprised if we had record turnout this year because of the fact that everyone will be getting a mail-in ballot for COVID. So an absentee ballot will be arriving at every registered voter's home. There's a lot of nervousness about the postal system. There are drop-off boxes everywhere. Well, not everywhere, but in all of our towns, hopefully. And so I'm hoping for, and wouldn't be surprised if 2020 was a record, or at least a recent record for voter turnout.
That will be good. I wanted to add one more thing before we go to questions, Marcel, and Debbie can weigh in on this too. I'm asked a lot about what the current economic situation in the pandemic, how that might affect these propositions. And I identified two that I think will be affected, just in my view, the most. One is this Prop 15, the split roll property tax. I think with the problems businesses have been having, that voters will be more reluctant to approve Prop 15. I think they will not want to put the additional burden on some of these larger businesses. Just my opinion. On the flip side, I do think voters, I think this whole pandemic and the economic problems, people out of work, has accelerated the housing crisis in California. So I think Prop 21, the rent control measure, is a little more likely to pass under these conditions. Historically, Californians have rejected rent control measures. I think they're going to be a little more friendly toward them when so many people are struggling to make ends meet. Debbie, you can weigh in on that too, but I just thought I'd throw that in before we go to questions.
No, I agree with your assessment. I think that's absolutely right. I think we're going to be reading a lot about those two propositions in particular with that in mind.
Okay.
All
So, Marcel, we're all ready for your questions.
Yeah, thank you, James. And Jenny, James, and Debbie, we really appreciate everything that you guys have done to share. Here's the contact information for this. I just got a message asking if you all can get a copy. Of course, we're going to send out a copy. We're going to actually post this, and in the link on our YouTube page, we'll make sure that this is available for anyone that wants to view it, and also to have a copy of the presentation here. I want to say a big shout out to the city of Calabasas, to their folks. They helped put a lot of this stuff together. James's team there did a lot of the research, and it's a lot of information, as you can tell. These general elections, they pile the propositions on, and we have propositions that should have been in 2018 that didn't make it to 2020 in Prop 20. And thank you, Debbie and James and Jenny, of course, for all your work to put this together and all your work you're doing to get voters to be engaged. So we have a Q&A. We have time for Q&A. We have about 10 minutes left in the session. So if you have a question, there's a Q&A little button up at the top, this side of your screen. Hit that Q&A, type it in, or you can type it into the chat. But either way, we'll see it. I'll give you a couple minutes to type that in. And just to reiterate, we did take a support position for Prop 20, which is going to reform AB 109, Prop 47, Prop 57, the language for some of the repeat habitual offenders. And we did stay neutral on the rent control because, as James mentioned and Debbie mentioned, our cities were very split. Some cities are very supportive of rent control. Some absolutely don't want it. So we said, we'll just leave that out. And every time something's controversial, we tend to stay away from it. So
Marcel, while we're waiting for questions, do you have any questions of us? Anything came to mind?
I don't know, because I've been in this. I know we have Lindsay on. Lindsay, do you have any questions? Is there anything you want to cover?
I thought you guys gave a great presentation. Each community is going to focus on what their own priorities are and what their residents are looking for. I know our city just voted on some of these items and took action. So I would suspect that some cities might do that as well with regard to a lot of what you presented. There's a lot there to consider. How would you recommend cities to engage if they want more information? Are they able to reach out to each of you? Are there organizations that you suggest that they talk to get more information on each of the items that you presented? What other resources are out there for people? Maybe
first of all, they're always welcome to contact me and Debbie, and we put our contact information there. We'll do our best to answer questions. But if you go to the California Secretary of State's website, they do have a listing of organizations pro and con. And they also list arguments pro and con, and they're pretty neutral for the most part. I mean, they tried their best to be nonpartisan and list everything. And then if you contact those organizations, they will give you their view on something. So that's how I would start. Also, LA County for Measure J or anything, locally.
Thank you, guys. So we don't have a question. We do have a comment from Jennifer Kwan. She said, great presentation, a lot of helpful information. So I know you will be working with her, James, on the other side with the league stuff. And just a quick announcement for you all that are listening right now. We did just confirm yesterday our first ever all cities forum for district attorneys. So we did confirm District Attorney Jackie Lacey and Mr. Gascon. And we will be hosting that on October 13th. It'll be from noon to 1 o'clock. That was their only, we tried to do it in the evening, but their only availability was during the day. So we're gonna do the same thing as we're doing here. We'll record it. We're gonna prep some questions for them. It will be hosted by our president, Lindsay, and the LA County League's LA County Division, their president, Blanca Pacheco from Downey. So I expect that to be great. I think this is gonna be the start of something that we do continually for countywide offices, whether it be supervisor, assessor, any of those types of stuff, because it's something that all of our cities are interested in, and together we represent all 88 cities in the county. So we do have some questions coming in now, so I'm going to ask questions first from Margaret Clark. The threshold, she's asking, the threshold for taxing the businesses get taxed is $3 million in this inflated property era. Isn't that extremely low, and would it affect small businesses who may move out of California or raise costs on customers?
I'm pulling that up. I believe that was one of the critiques of it, was that particularly in the California and Southern California, the metropolitan Los Angeles and San Francisco. I believe that is one of the critiques, is that the $3 million is really arbitrary and not particularly realistic.
And remember that the 3 million, just so everybody knows, is a combined value. So if the same owner, if an owner owns a $1 million assessed building, and then he owns another $2 million assessed building, then they're at 3 million if it's the same person.
Be pretty easy to get to 3 million.
Depending on where you are, yes,
yeah,
today it can.
Yeah, exactly. It's a good
Great
question.
Okay, now we have some questions coming in, and this is coming in. So these two questions are actually very identical, and I guess this is aimed more toward me. It's asking if the Contract Cities Association will take a position on Measure J. The short answer to that is yes. We are going to be discussing it at our legislative committee meeting next week. It's on the agenda. I can tell you early on, we expressed some opposition. We didn't take an opposed position per se, but we did express an opposition to it because of the process. The process felt rushed. It felt there was no stakeholder engagement. There was no analysis of the long-term impacts or any unintended consequences, so we expressed a lot of concern. I do know that the league, the LA County division of the league, has taken an opposed position to Measure J, and I do know there's a lot of concern coming from our cities, not so much on the merits of this measure, but the way it was introduced and the speed in which it was introduced. If my opinion, this is my personal opinion, if this was a measure that was that significant or that positive for the county going forward, we could have had this on the ballot next March, and we could have taken the time to have those engagement meetings and to actually listen to the cities and listen to the stakeholders that are going to be impacted by this positively and negatively. And I know there was some questions also about the United Way's position, and there was some things that came up in the meetings regarding a survey that they did and how they were involved with it and some potential conflicts and that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of kind of working parts to this, but we'll discuss it in length next week at our legislative committee meeting, and we'll report that out to you. We'll put out an announcement once we make a decision on that, and a couple of the other propositions that we're going to talk about next week. And that's all we have for questions, unless I see any from anybody else. We're right close to the 1 o'clock mark. So again, let me say thank you to Jenny, thank you to James, thank you to Debbie, Lindsay. It's been great having you all here today. It's been great. This is our first ever virtual Fall Educational Summit. We all would have rather have been in Arrowhead earlier this month, but this is what we have to do in this unfortunate time. We are planning to be back next year, hopefully. And right now we're looking at our next big event is scheduled for January. We're supposed to be in Sacramento, but not knowing where we're going to be with the vaccine and where COVID-19 is going to be in this fall season. Hopefully the numbers stay low, but we're going to start planning. Our staff is planning for a virtual Sacramento legislative orientation tour slot is what we call it. So that's what we're planning for right now as a contingency in case we're not able to go up to Sacramento. So please stay tuned for the details on that as we get closer to the end of the year. And we'll talk to you all soon. And hopefully we'll see you all at our first All Cities District Attorneys Forum on October 13th at noon. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Bye.
Thank you.